Hi, in this video we're going to explore the cardiac cycle. We'll look at how the atria and ventricles contract and relax, how the heart valves open and close, and how blood flows through the heart. We'll also learn how to interpret the cardiac cycle graph, including changes in pressure, volume, and electrical change shown on the ECG. Now, as you can see, this graph looks very complex and kind of intimidating, but it's a lot easier to understand than you think, and I'll prove it down as I break it down and explain later in the video. So by the end of this video, you will have a clear understanding of what happens during each stage of the cardiac cycle and why it happens. So let's get started. So what exactly is the cardiac cycle? Now the cardiac cycle is a sequence of events that occur during the completion of one heartbeat, and it involves repeated contraction and relaxation of the cardiac muscles. Now, to understand this video on the cardiac cycle, you should know how blood flows through the heart and the events associated with it. Now, if you don't know how blood flows through the heart, I suggest that you first watch my video on heart anatomy and blood flow, and that will make whatever I'm explaining in this video flow very smoothly. So the cardiac cycle involves four main stages. We have arteriodiastole. So here the atria are relaxed. Then we have arteriosystole, the atria contract. Then we have ventricular systole. Here the ventricles contract. Then lastly we have the ventricular diastole. So this means that it ends with the ventricles relaxed. So let's break each of these down. So by now you know that the cardiac cycle begins with arteriodiastole. So during arteriodiastole, blood returns to the heart. Oxygenated blood returns to the left side of the heart through the pulmonary vein, and deoxygenated blood returns to the heart through the vena cava on the right side of the heart. And keep in mind that during this, the atria and the ventricles are both relaxed, so the atria are filled with blood and pressure inside them increases, and this pressure increases and eventually pushes the atrioventricular valves open. So during arteriodiastole, the only thing you should know is that the atria relax and fill with blood. That's the basic thing you should know. Next on the cardiac cycle is arteriosystole. Now here the atria contract, and this contraction pushes the remaining blood from the atria into the ventricles through the open atrioventricular valves. So here during arteriosystole, the atria contract and push blood into the ventricles. That's what you need to know. Next is ventricular systole. So during ventricular systole, the ventricles contract strongly and pressure in the ventricles rises, causing the atrioventricular valves to close, hence preventing the backflow of blood from the ventricles back to the atria. This pressure also causes the semilunar valves to open, and the blood is therefore pushed from the ventricles into the aorta and pulmonary artery on the left and right side of the heart respectively. Now something unique and interesting about ventricular systole is that when the pressure in the ventricles rises, remember I told you it causes the atrioventricular valves to close. Now the closure of those atrioventricular valves produces the first sound of the heartbeat, and that is the lub sound and the lub-dub sound of the heart. So the first sound of the heart, the lub sound of the heart, is produced when the atrioventricular valves close during ventricular systole. So what you need to remember on ventricular systole is that the ventricles contract and pump blood into the aorta and pulmonary artery on the left and right side of the heart respectively. And lastly, on the cardiac cycle, we have ventricular diastole. So here the ventricles are relaxing. The semilunar valves also close, preventing blood from flowing back into the ventricles. Now when the semilunar valves close, they produce the second heartbeat sound, that is the dub sound. So the dub sound in the lub-dub sound of the heartbeat is caused when the semilunar valves close during ventricular diastole. So what you need to know on ventricular diastole is that the ventricles relax, and that is what you need to know on the events that occur during the cardiac cycle. With that said, we can now move on to the cardiac cycle graph. Now it really looks intimidating, and honestly it gave me a hard time to finally understand it because it looks complicated. That's until I realized how simple it can really be, and the secret to understanding this graph is to understand those stages of the cardiac cycle that I just explained, and understanding each event that occurs during the cardiac cycle. So let's break it down. Now this graph shows what is happening during one complete cardiac cycle or one complete heartbeat. So it brings together several events happening at the same time, and these include contraction and relaxation of the atria and ventricles, changes in pressure, and these pressure changes include changes in atrial pressure, ventricular pressure and aortic pressure. It also involves changes in volume, specifically ventricular volume, and then it also brings together the opening and closing of the heart valves and electrical activity shown on the electrocardiogram or the ECG. So now under the ECG, what you should know is that the heart undergoes electrical current changes during depolarization and repolarization of the cardiac muscles, and these are picked by the cathode ray oscilloscope, and these produce the electrocardiogram or the ECG, which helps doctors to know the state of the heart and its health. And that's what you need to know on the ECG. Now the horizontal axis there represents the time taken for one complete cardiac cycle, and that is 0.8 seconds. So let's go through this graph step by step. Now I'll start with the electrocardiogram or the ECG, which is at the bottom of the curve, and as I already said, this shows the electrical activity of the heart. So first on our ECG is the P wave, and this represents the depolarization of the atria, which causes the atria to contract during arterial systole. Next on the ECG is the QRS complex, and this represents the depolarization of the ventricles, which triggers the ventricles to contract during ventricular systole. And lastly, on the ECG, we have the T wave, and this represents the repolarization of the ventricles, and this causes the ventricles to relax, and this is what triggers ventricular diastole. So please, you have to remember what each of those parts of the ECG represent. So I hope that is clear on the ECG. So unlike the normal cardiac cycle, which starts with arterial diastole, this graph, however, starts with arterial systole, which obviously means it starts with the atria contracting. Now this graph illustrates the pressure and volume changes during the mammalian cardiac cycle, and the pressure for this particular graph are measured in the left atrium and the left ventricle. So that includes the aorta, which is found on the left side of the heart. The volume changes, specifically the ventricular volume, are measured from both ventricles, so both the right and left ventricle, but we are going to focus mostly on the left side of the heart. So back to the beginning of this graph, I already said it begins with arterial systole, and arterial systole obviously means the atria are contracting due to the depolarization of the atria. Remember that depolarization appears as the P wave on the ECG. So by the time the atria contract, you should remember that they're already passively filled with blood returning from the body and lungs. So the atria contract, and that causes the atrial pressure to rise. Now during arterial systole, we should remember that the ventricles are relaxed, and therefore the ventricular pressure is lower compared to the arterial pressure. I hope that is clear. I want us to move together. Okay, so the atria contract, atrial pressure rises, and this forces blood into the ventricles. Now the ventricles start filling with blood, and because the ventricles are filling with blood, this causes the ventricular volume and to start increasing. So the ventricular volume starts increasing due to the ventricles filling with blood, and this leads to the next phase of the cardiac cycle, and this leads to ventricular systole, which basically means the ventricles start to contract due to depolarization of the ventricles, which appears as the QRS complex on our ECG. Now, you should remember that by the time this happens, the ventricles have already filled with blood, and when they contract, this leads to an increase in the ventricular pressure. When the ventricular pressure exceeds the atrial pressure, this immediately causes the atrioventricular valves to close, preventing blood from flowing back into the atria. Now, I remember I said that the closure of the atrioventricular valves produces the lab sound, which is the first sound in the lab dub sound of the heart. Now, if you remember the anatomy of the heart, specifically the left side of the heart, you will remember that from the left ventricle, blood flows into the aorta. Now, at this point, the aortic pressure is higher than the ventricular pressure, but because the ventricles keep contracting, the ventricular pressure eventually exceeds the aortic pressure. Now, let me give you a metaphor. Okay, let's imagine that you are pushing a door open, and on the other side, a friend of yours is trying to keep it closed. So the pressure is being applied on both sides of the door. So when the pressure you're applying on your side, let's imagine that pressure is the ventricular pressure. exceeds the pressure your friend is applying on the other side of the door, which you shall imagine is the aortic pressure, the door will open because your pressure has exceeded your friend's pressure, and therefore you will be able to enter the room. Same thing happens here. When the ventricular pressure exceeds the aortic pressure, the door opens, and that door is the left semilunar valve or the aortic valve. So the semilunar valve opens and blood flows into the aorta. So at this point, the ventricles are still contracting. So the ventricular pressure keeps increasing rapidly, and the aortic pressure also increases because blood is being forced into the aorta at a high pressure from the ventricles. Now, because blood is flowing out of the ventricles, the ventricular volume begins to fall or decrease. Now, eventually, because most of the blood has been pumped out of the ventricles, the ventricular pressure begins to fall, and the aortic pressure also begins to fall, specifically because less blood is being pumped into the aorta from the ventricles. So that causes the aortic pressure to also begin to fall. And that leads us to ventricular diastole. So now the ventricles begin to relax due to repolarization of the ventricles, which is represented as the T wave on the ECG. So the ventricles relax and the ventricular pressure falls even faster than before. So when the ventricular pressure is lower than the aortic pressure, when the ventricular pressure falls below the aortic pressure, the semilunar valves close, producing the dub sound, which is the second sound in the lap dub sound of the heart. Now, if you look carefully at the aortic pressure, there is a small dip in the aortic pressure just where the ventricular pressure exceeds it, and that is called the dikaryotic notch. And it occurs because when the semilunar valve, or the aortic valve in this case, closes, there is a brief change in blood flow. So what happens is that a tiny amount of the blood flows backwards towards the closed semilunar valve, causing a small dip in the aortic pressure, which is completely normal. Now, at the same time, the atria is passively filling with blood in preparation for the next cardiac cycle. Now, this causes the atrial pressure to once again rise, and when the ventricular pressure falls below the atrial pressure once again, the atrioventricular valves open, and some of this blood moves from the atria to the ventricles. This is called ventricular filling. So the ventricles fill with some of the blood from the atria, and this is called ventricular filling. It also causes the ventricular pressure to slightly increase, so that the ventricular volume also starts to increase because the ventricles are being filled with some of the blood from the atria. And this is all in preparation for the next cardiac cycle, and that's how the cardiac cycle repeats itself. So that is the cardiac cycle graph explained. If you do not understand it, please go back and rewatch it as many times as you can until it finally clicks. So the important thing to understand here is that electrical activity causes mechanical activity, and mechanical activity causes pressure changes, and these pressure changes determine when the valves open and close. The valves control the direction of blood flow, and the ventricular volume changes throughout the cycle. And that brings us to the end of our lesson on the cardiac cycle. Today we have seen how the heart works continuously through a coordinated sequence of atrial and ventricular contraction and relaxation. We also looked at how electrical activity, pressure changes, valve movements, ventricular volume work together to produce each heartbeat. And I hope this lesson has made the cardiac cycle easier to understand and the graph much easier to interpret. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share for more fascinating videos. This is Discover Biology, and I'll see you in my next video.